Okay, I'm done with controversial subjects. Let's get back to learning Warhammer and getting really freaking good at this game. So, a lot of people seem to be confused on when is the appropriate time to start a unit in reserves, how to do reserves, how to arrive from reserves, what is the best time to rapid ingress versus coming normally. We're going to answer all of those questions today. We're going to break it down in detail so all of you guys can master reserves. So we're going to start by answering some of the questions that you need to ask yourself when you're deciding what to put in reserves. And then I'm also going to answer just the commonly asked questions about the actual mechanics of reserves. So like, what's the difference between strategic reserves? What's deep striking? But I'll do that after I go through all of the checklists that I want you guys to ask yourself when you're deciding what and how much to put in reserves. Okay, so let's start with that checklist. And this is gonna be a fairly short and sweet video, but it's gonna answer all these questions for you. And if you run through this checklist pregame, guys, you're gonna get it right. All right. So basically, here's how we do it. When you have a bunch of units in the army, and you got to figure out what's going in reserves, what's starting on the board. First question you ask yourself, can I safely deploy this unit? Because the reality is, in Warhammer 40,000 10th edition, this game is incredibly lethal. And it's not a bad thing, it's actually very fun, but you gotta kind of assume that if you're gonna be seen, you're gonna be destroyed. So if your models can't really be safely deployed, where if you happen to go second, your opponent can't draw a good line of sight on you, then you might want to consider putting that unit in reserves. It kind of is that simple. So if the terrain doesn't allow you to safely deploy everything, put some things in reserve. Do you lack a safe path for this unit? And what I mean by safe path is there going to be a safe way for you to be able to move your unit from point A to point B? A lot of times this is very troubling for things like infantry if they're not inside a transport. How are they going to get to the ruin where they're going to be able to safely stage behind it? Are they going to have to rely on rolling a 6-inch advance? Because if that's the case, sometimes coming out of a strategic reserve or even your deep strike, which tends to be much better, is going to be a better solution for them to get the unit where you want them to be on the board. All right. Now, can your opponent rapidly flood the board, preventing you from getting anywhere that is useful? This is a great question to ask yourself. And this is a really important one for a lot of popular armies, whether you're going to be, especially right now in the meta. So if you're going to be playing against Mordaka, for example, and they have the Zodgrod unit that's going to go all the way up, you know they're going to move block your army turn one. And if you don't have infiltrators of your own to stop that move block, then you have to be aware that you're going to have to figure out how you're going to actually get onto the board. So a lot of times reserves will solve that question. So if you know that they can rapidly just move block you in positions where you just can't handle being move blocked, sometimes reserves is the answer so that you can come in on a unexpected part of the table. A lot of times, it's also worth considering that if your unit is having to start in strategic reserves versus deep strike, but we'll kind of go through the difference of those in the next slide. All right, now the next question you want to ask yourself is, can you exploit a rapid ingress to catch your opponents off guard? And this is a really, really good question, and there's going to be a lot of different answers for different armies. So rapid ingress is a very, very powerful ability, allowing you to deep strike at or arrive from strategic reserves at the end of your opponent's movement phase. So after they do their reserves, you get to spend 1 CP and bring in a unit from reserves that you have in your army. And this can be really powerful for a couple of different things. One, you can set up heroic interventions with it. So a really fun strategy is if your opponent is setting up a good charge on one of your weaker melee units and you rapid ingress, say, the Lionel Johnson, and then he's set up for a heroic intervention where if your opponent charges you, you'll just 1 CP heroically intervene, fight first, and murder his unit. That's a really big issue, and you can do that with rapid ingresses. You can also do things like setting up overwatches your opponent wasn't expecting. So if you're playing Death Guard, for example, you can rapid ingress your Death Shroud Terminators to have a huge flamer overwatch when your opponent tries to charge. This is a really, really big problem, and when you can do these little things, well, it can really screw your opponent's game plan up because they weren't ready for that position. So rapid ingress is a very powerful ability to consider. Then, can you exploit can you exploit the opponent's lack of units or screening to gain an advantage? So if you're playing against, Custodes, and you know that they're still desperately struggling to make 3 Warden Bricks work, even though now they're only going to have 8 units or whatever with it. Well, you might want to take advantage of deep striking and strategic reserves because it's going to be very challenging for that opponent to have enough models in enough places to stop you from being able to come in off of a board edge or 9 inches away from him. And that can give you a huge positional advantage. So when your opponent has low model count armies, that can be very advantageous for you if you were trying to arrive from reserves because you're going to have a lot more freedom where you come onto the board. Then you go, can I force my opponent to screen, leading to his demise? Now, this is something that I don't hear anyone really talking about, but it's something I very often do. I will take a unit that could start on the board, but also I can start them in Deep Strike. And the only purpose I have them starting in Deep Strike rather than on the board is because when I start them in Deep Strike, it's going to force my opponent to leave his units maybe further away from me than he wants to be, because he's going to be having to screen my units. I'll do things like this with the Sanguinor all the time when I'm playing Blood Angels. Sometimes my opponent will make an early charge and I won't bring him down in for the heroic intervention, which means that my opponent is then going to have to be screening me, say in his deployment zone, making sure I can't rapid ingress in places where I want to rapid ingress. And that really takes away from his board presence. So this is something that you can consider as well. Next one I want to talk about is, does the deployment itself support getting behind the enemy lines? And I'm not talking about the secondary behind enemy lines. I'm talking about getting into the deployment zone. So it's pretty common for people to put too much into reserves, especially on deployments like Search and Destroy. In Search and Destroy, guys, the reality is your opponent's deployment zone is really not that large, and it's very easy for them to keep it screened so that you just cannot come in Deep Strike anywhere in the opponent's deployment zone, and you're not going to be able to come in from strategic reserves in your opponent's deployment zone until round 3. So it actually makes it very easy for them to deny you coming down where you want to come down. That doesn't mean you don't use reserves on strategic on Search and Destroy. It just means you need to consider, where are you going to actually come down. Then again, you have certain maps like Crucible of Battle, or even like a Hammer and Anvil, where the distance that your opponent has to screen to stop you from coming down the deployment zone is huge, and most armies, at least many armies, can't effectively screen you. Now, if you don't know what I mean by screening, by the way, screening is the process of putting units in certain positions that your opponent, if they want to arrive from Deep Strike or strategic reserves, they're going to have to arrive 9 inches away from your models, so you can really kind of push them away from arriving where they want to arrive, right? Then we go, does my unit have an ability to get where I need them to go? So this is another one. It kind of goes on with, do you have a safe path for this unit? But like, for example, if I am wanting to run Terminators or Deathwing Knights, I only move 5 inches. Starting them on the board is probably just not a good idea. And if I don't have a transport for them, I'm going to have to figure out how I'm actually going to get these units in a position that's useful for me. Realistically, Deep Strike or Strategic Reserves is the answer. This can also be something that really other people struggle with, right? I'll give you a great example of how this question can be answered. Centurion Devastators historically just aren't used outside of Vanguard. And they're not used any longer, but since it's a recent example, I think it's going to help you guys understand what I'm talking about. However, in Vanguard, if you take the character Uriel Ventress, you can give Deep Strike to your Centurion Devastators, and then suddenly they become an amazing unit because they have the ability to actually get to where you want them to be on the board. Whereas if you don't give them Deep Strike, they're going to have to arrive via Strategic Reserves, which is a little more limited, or you're going to have to hope that just 4 inches of movement is enough to get them where they want to go, which doesn't really work. Now, this loophole has been closed. It wasn't a loophole. This ability has been closed, and it has been edited out in the last data slate. But this is the kind of thinking I want you to have. Just because a unit is good, the question you also have to ask yourself is, how are you going to get them to where they're effective? So sometimes reserves will absolutely be the answer to how you're going to get them where you want them to be. Then the question you need to ask is, does the terrain bottleneck you too much to get to where you need to be? This is something that really will affect vehicle-heavy armies a lot. I know when I'm running my Bloody Road, which is my take on the Blood Angels, which is still a beast of a list, mind you, sometimes I'm going to have to start 1 or 2 tanks in reserves because I've got like 7 or 8 tanks in that army. And it can be just really hard to move everything up the board where I want it to go. So starting something in strategic reserves will actually give me a much clearer path to move all of my units. And it can really try to keep my opponent a little bit honest by having to screen, certain areas of the battlefield that they just don't really want to be screening. And then lastly, you're going to ask yourself, does your opponent have key units that have to be kept safe? This is a really important one. So let's think of it as you're playing Dark Angels and they have Azrael, who's giving them the extra CP, which they just have to have every turn. Well, a lot of times a cheeky little Inceptor drop can just murder Azrael. So that's going to be really forcing him to have Azrael in a different position that you can't just snipe him out. Or let's say you're playing against Necrons, and Necrons have that stupid character, Star Shatter Arsenal, that stupid character who's going to give -1 damage to a unit. Well, if they have that super key model who is just actually the linchpin of their entire army, sometimes having something in reserves to actually go drop down and assassinate him is a really, really, really good thing to have. So I want you to consider reserves a little bit more strongly when they have those key little units that just they have to protect. All right, so let's talk about some of the actual reserves. So these are the questions I want you to ask yourself pre-deployment to figure out what you need in reserves. But let's go through some of the actual FAQ questions that people have for reserves. These are the questions that I've received on different live streams I've run and just in the Discord in general for some of the newer members. So I figured this would be a good opportunity for me to help people clear up some misconceptions that people have about the rules for reserves. So here we go. In Strike Force, and I only really talk about Strike Force on this channel because we are a competitive channel. That doesn't mean that you can't play Incursion or Onslaught style games. I hope you do, and I hope you have a great time with it. But that's not a competitive style of Warhammer, so I just don't really talk about it too much. Now, so in Strike Force, where you have 2,000 points of your army, up to 1,000 points of the army can be in reserves. Now, this is a part that's very frequently confused by people. 500 points can be in strategic reserves. Strategic reserves is different from reserves. All strategic reserves count as reserves, but it's not necessarily that all reserves count as strategic reserves, right? So you have a maximum of 500 points for strategic reserves. Now, for transports and anything that's inside of the transports that happen to be in reserves, those all count towards your strategic reserve limit, unless your transport happens to have deep strike. Some redeploy abilities will also allow you to put extra units into reserves, because when you start the game, you can only start with 500 in strategic reserves, 1,000 in reserves in total. But if you have a special ability that allows you to redeploy some of your units before the game starts and put them back into reserves, then you can bypass this limitation and you can actually go above the 1,000 points limits for units in reserves. Now, from the second battle round onwards, strategic reserves, specifically strategic reserve units, can arrive wholly within 6 inches of any battlefield edge and not in the enemy's deployment zone. So basically, this means that you're only going to have like 3 battlefield edges that you can arrive from and just not within your opponent's deployment zone. That can be a little bit different on specifically Search and Destroy, but it's still, you can't come within the deployment zone. And then from the third battle round on, strategic reserves units that arrive must be set up wholly within 6 inches of any battlefield edge, and it loses the restriction on the deployment zone. So you can strategic reserve into your opponent's deployment zone from the third battle round on. Strategic reserve units can use the rapid ingress stratagem, but they still have to arrive from strategic reserves, meaning they are still limited to battle round and wholly within 6 inches of a table edge restrictions. Now, a few more details about strategic reserves. Matched play rules, not the core rules, this is pretty key, will restrict deep strike units from arriving in battle round 1 if they start the game in reserves. So this is where people get really confused by some of the uppy downy armies. Can they deep strike in turn 1? And by uppy downy, that's the colloquial term for armies that have the ability to go back into reserves at the end of your opponent's turn. These are things like your Grey Knights, your Hypercrypt Necrons, Death Watch, and some other armies have these abilities as well. So what they allow for is if the models start on the battlefield, then what happens is at the end of your opponent's turn, they can go up into reserves and arrive next turn. This is an exception to having to arrive in turn 2 as according to matched play rules. Because matched play rules say you can only arrive from deep strike or strategic reserves, you can only arrive from reserves in turn 2 if you started the game in reserves. But units that start the game on the table and are then put into reserves have an exception to this. So if you have the deep strike keyword and you start the game on the table, so let's take Grey Knights for example, and you go second, so your opponent finishes their turn, their battle round, and they go first, or they finish their turn, they went first. You can pick your units up at the end of your opponent's turn and then deep strike them in turn 1 because your unit started on the battlefield, which is all the difference from starting in reserves, okay? Now, strategic reserves units, not deep strike units, remember, I know it's a little confusing, but they're different things. Strategic reserve units can still not come in on turn 1, even if they started on the battlefield, because they have no mechanism for which to arrive, because strategic reserve units, like I have posted over here, can only arrive starting from battle round 2. But deep strike, which is a reserve but not strategic reserve, I know. I wish Games Workshop wrote it a little bit differently myself. Have no limitations on arriving battle round 1. That limitation is only in match play rules, not in the core rules. And the match play rules specifically say units that start in reserves, not units that start on the battlefield. So that's why uppy downy abilities can override since the units start on the battlefield. So guys, this is answering a bunch of your frequently asked questions for deep strikes and reserves and when to put units in reserves, because this can be a really complicated matter. Now, if you need more advice and more help determining when to start things in reserve, when to bring them onto the table, those are probably going to be a little more individualized to you. You can ask them in the Discord and the members side of the Discord, and I'm sure people will be happy to help you. I hop in there as well sometimes. And you can also sign up for coaching where I can help you answer all these questions and help you basically achieve all of your Warhammer 40,000 goals. It is a blast doing that and serving people, and I'm having a great time with it. So guys, that's the video for today. I'm going to go and pop off here, and I hope you all have a really, really happy day, and crump on. Bye-bye.